today we're diving into something really crucial for understanding, well, how markets actually work.
Yeah, we're talking about fundamental analysis.
Exactly. And, sometimes I think that term fundamental analysis can sound kind of intimidating, like it's this really complex thing.
It's really not as complicated as it sounds.
Right. And it's so essential.
Yeah, because it's less about, trying to predict the future or anything like that. It's
Right.
more about understanding the forces at play.
That shape the markets.
Yeah, the stuff that makes them move.
Exactly.
And that helps you make more informed decisions, which is what we all want, right?
Of course. That's the goal.
Yeah, so when we talk about fundamentals, we're really talking about the building blocks,
Okay.
the economic factors that really influence how markets behave.
It's like the foundation of a house, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You need that strong foundation to build something that lasts.
That's a great way to put it.
So, where do we even start with this? In your notes, you mentioned something about economic indicators.
Oh, yeah, these are super important.
Okay.
Think of them like a country's economic dashboard.
Okay.
They give you all the vital signs,
Interesting.
like inflation, GDP, employment numbers. These are all key indicators.
Got it.
They paint a picture of whether an economy is healthy or if it's struggling or somewhere in between,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Gives you a sense of the overall picture.
Okay, so let's say inflation is going crazy. Like it's way up.
Yeah.
What kind of signal does that send, and how would that even impact someone's investment strategy?
Well, high inflation, it usually means that your purchasing power takes a hit.
Right, your money just doesn't go as far.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're buying less with the same amount of money.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So for investors, this might mean shifting their strategy a bit.
Okay, how so?
Well, they might start looking at asset classes that tend to perform well when inflation is high, things like commodities or real estate.
Oh, interesting. So their value goes up as inflation rises.
Right? They kind of act as a hedge against that loss of purchasing power.
That's actually really smart. So you have to be adaptable, right?
Exactly. You have to adjust your strategy based on what those indicators are telling you.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach to investing, clearly. Now, you also mentioned central banks, and they play a huge role here, right?
Absolutely massive.
What's their main function when it comes to all of this?
Think of central banks as like the referees in the economic game.
Okay, I like that.
They set the rules and try to keep things fair.
Gotcha.
And their most powerful tool,
Let me guess. Interest rates.
bingo. By raising or lowering interest rates, they can really influence the economy.
By influencing what specifically?
Borrowing costs, how much people are spending, and just overall economic activity.
It's all connected.
Totally.
Could you give me a real-world example of that, just to make it super clear how it works?
Absolutely. Remember back in 2022 when inflation was a huge concern?
Yeah, it felt like everyone was talking about it.
For good reason. Anyway, the Federal Reserve, that's the central bank in the U.S.,
Right.
they decided to step in and try to get things under control.
Okay.
So what they did was implement a series of interest rate hikes.
And how does that impact inflation?
Well, when interest rates go up, borrowing money becomes more expensive.
I see.
And when it costs more to borrow, people tend to borrow less, which means they have less money to spend.
Makes sense.
And when spending slows down, it can help cool down the economy and theoretically bring inflation back under control.
So it's a balancing act.
Totally. A very delicate one.
Because you need some growth, but too much can lead to inflation.
Right. And if they overcorrect and slow things down too much, that can stifle the economy.
It's like finding that sweet spot, right?
Exactly.
This is fascinating. Now, we can't talk about market forces without bringing up something that can be a little unpredictable.
You're talking about geopolitics.
Yeah. It feels like every time I turn on the news, there's some major global event that's shaking up the markets.
Oh, absolutely. Geopolitics is a wild card, for sure.
Right. You never know what's going to happen.
And it has a huge impact on the market.
Can you think of any recent examples that really illustrate this?
Well, think back to early 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge deal.
That conflict sent shockwaves through the entire global economy.
Absolutely.
It disrupted supply chains, especially for things like wheat.
Right. Ukraine is a major wheat exporter.
Yeah, and it really messed with energy prices, too, because, well, Russia's a big oil and gas exporter.
Yeah, it impacted everything.
Pretty much. It was a big deal. And it really shows how something happening on one side of the world can ripple out and affect everyone.
And that uncertainty makes investors nervous.
For sure. Anytime you have these big geopolitical events, It creates volatility in the market.
Volatility meaning prices going up and down, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's because people are unsure what will happen next, so they don't know whether to buy, sell, or hold their investments.
Exactly. It's all about confidence or lack thereof.
So, with the conflict in Ukraine, sanctions were imposed on Russia, right?
Yeah, a lot of countries impose sanctions.
And that created a lot of uncertainty about the future supply of oil and gas.
Yeah, because people were worried that those supplies would be disrupted even further.
Right, which makes sense. And those concerns, how did they actually manifest in the markets?
Well, you saw energy prices fluctuate like crazy.
So they went up.
Yeah, they shot up initially, and that had a knock-on effect on other industries like transportation and manufacturing.
Because they rely on oil and gas, right?
Exactly.
Wow, so it really is all connected.
It's a giant web.
Okay, so we've talked about economic indicators, which give us a snapshot of how the economy is doing.
Right.
We've talked about central banks who try to steer the economy in the right direction using things like interest rates.
They're like the economic pilots.
I like that analogy. And then we have geopolitics, which throws a wrench into everything.
That's a great way to put it.
It feels like all these things are constantly pushing and pulling on the markets.
It's true. They really are.
So how can someone listening to this, how can they use this information to make better financial decisions? That's what it all boils down to, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, you're not going to become an expert overnight, but just by being aware of these factors, you're already ahead of the game.
Okay, so awareness is key.
For sure. Keep an eye on those economic indicators, see what the central banks are up to, and try to stay informed about major geopolitical events. These things are all reported in the news all the time.
Right. It's not about digging for some super secret information.
Exactly. It's all out there.
So what you're saying is that it's not enough to just look at a company's financials, right?
Well, those are important too, of course.
Right. But it's bigger than that.
Yes. You have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. See how everything fits together.
Connect the dots.
Exactly.
So when I'm thinking about investing my money, I need to be thinking about all of these things at the same time.
Pretty much. It might seem like a lot, but once you start understanding how these forces interact, it becomes much clearer.
And that's what fundamental analysis is all about.
Exactly. It's not about predicting the future. It's about understanding the present.
I love that. And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with something to really think about. Knowing all of this, how might you approach your own financial decisions or investments differently? It's definitely given me a lot to consider. This has been such an insightful deep dive. Thanks for breaking it all down so clearly.
Anytime. And remember, the world of finance is constantly changing. But if you can grasp these fundamental concepts, you'll be much better equipped to handle whatever comes your way.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, and until next time.
See you then.